The dust settled on Main Street as Samuel McKenzie rode through Copper Ridge like a storm cloud, promising thunder. His black coat billowed behind him, and the silver star on his chest caught the dying light of the Wyoming sun. But Samuel wasn't a sheriff. He was something far more dangerous in these parts. The town's most feared debt collector, a man who had built an empire on other people's misery and desperation. When Samuel McKenzie came calling, families packed their belongings and disappeared in the night. When he knocked on your door, you prayed you had enough money to satisfy his hunger. Samuel had methods that went far beyond legal collection practices, burning crops and threatening families to get what he was owed. But what nobody in Copper Ridge knew was that Samuel's greatest weakness wasn't greed or violence. It was his 19-year-old daughter, Clara, and she was about to tear his world apart in ways he never imagined. Clara lived in the grandest house in Copper Ridge, but she might as well have been living in a prison. Samuel controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to the books she was allowed to read. The isolation had made Clara hungry for connection, desperate for any glimpse of the world beyond her father's suffocating control. Clara McKenzie had spent her entire life in her father's shadow, watching him destroy families and crush dreams with the same cold efficiency he used to polish his guns. She had learned to be invisible, to speak only when spoken to never question the streams of broken people who came to their house begging for mercy that never came. But on this particular autumn evening, as golden leaves danced in the wind outside her bedroom window, Clara was doing something she had never done before. She was preparing to meet a man her father would kill if he knew. Every choice felt monumental as she dressed. Every glance in the mirror, a declaration that she was more than Samuel McKenzie's obedient daughter. When she finally slipped her father's pearl earrings into her ears, pearls that had belonged to a banker's wife who couldn't pay her debts, Clara felt like she was putting on a new identity, becoming someone brave enough to choose love over safety. Jake Sullivan waited for her by the old oak tree at the edge of town, just as he had for the past 3 weeks. Jake was everything her father despised: poor, honest, and unafraid. He worked as a ranch hand for the Hendersons, barely making enough to keep food on his table, but he had the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving real hardship. When he smiled at Clara during that first chance encounter at the general store, she felt something she had never experienced in her sheltered, fearful life. She felt alive. Their first meeting had been pure accident. Clara had knocked over a display of ribbons while shopping, and Jake had helped her gather them without treating her like the feared debt collector's daughter. Their hands had touched briefly when they both reached for the same spool of yellow ribbon, and Clara had looked up into the kindest eyes she had ever seen. She had fled the store immediately, her heart pounding with terror and exhilaration. Their secret meetings had become the brightest part of Clara's existence. Jake told her stories about his dreams of owning land someday, about a world where a man's worth wasn't measured by fear he could instill in others. Clara found herself laughing for the first time in years, sharing her own dreams of escape. Jake never pushed her for information about Samuel, never tried to use her to get to her father. He simply saw her as Clara, a young woman with hopes and dreams that deserved to flourish. What Clara didn't know was that Jake Sullivan had his own history with Samuel McKenzie. 5 years ago, Samuel had foreclosed on the Sullivan family farm, driving Jake's parents into poverty and ultimately to their graves. The Sullivan farm had been in the family for 3 generations, but when drought destroyed consecutive harvests and Jake's father borrowed money from Samuel, the deliberately complex loan terms ensured default. When Tom Sullivan couldn't make his payments, Samuel had seized everything the family had built. Jake's father had died of a heart attack 6 months later, and his mother had followed within a year. Jake had recognized Clara immediately that day in the store, but something about her gentle spirit had stirred something in him beyond revenge. He had fallen in love with the daughter of his greatest enemy, and every secret meeting was both a betrayal and a redemption. The first time Clara had truly smiled at him, Jake had felt something in his chest break open, something he thought had died with his parents. He realized that revenge had been keeping him alive, but love might actually let him live. As Clara slipped out of her bedroom window that October night, she had no idea that her father had been watching her carefully. Samuel McKenzie hadn't built his reputation by being careless. He had noticed the changes in his daughter, the way she hummed while doing chores, the secretive smiles she tried to hide. These were the behaviors of a young woman in love, and Samuel recognized them because he had been in love once himself, long ago, with Clara's mother. Eleanor McKenzie had been the daughter of a territorial judge, a woman who had believed she could civilize her husband. For a few precious years after Clara's birth, Samuel had tried to be the man Eleanor wanted him to be, but when Eleanor died of fever when Clara was 7, Samuel's grief had twisted into something dark and possessive. He had told himself that everything he did was to protect Clara, but the truth was that Samuel had become a monster to avoid the vulnerability of love. He had followed Clara twice, staying far back to avoid detection. What he discovered filled him with rage so pure, it scared even him. His precious daughter was meeting secretly with Jake Sullivan, the son of the couple whose farm he had taken. The irony was perfect and cruel. Alongside the rage was something else that surprised him. Fear. Not fear of Jake Sullivan, but fear of losing Clara the same way he had lost Eleanor. Samuel had spent 2 sleepless nights considering his options, from violence to bribery. But every time he reached for his rifle, he would think of Clara's face, and the horror she would feel if he made her hate him. That night, as Clara ran toward her forbidden love, Samuel followed at a distance. He watched from the shadows as Clara threw herself into Jake's arms, listened as they made plans to run away together. And when he had heard enough, Samuel McKenzie stepped out of the shadows and spoke his daughter's name. The sound of his voice was like a gunshot, freezing both young people in place. Clara's face went white with terror, but Jake stepped protectively in front of her, even knowing he faced death. Samuel looked at them both for a long moment. He saw his daughter's fear, Jake's desperate courage, and something else that hit him like a physical blow. He saw love, real love, the kind he had shared with Eleanor, the kind that made people willing to sacrifice everything for each other. "Clara," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying none of the rage she had expected. "Come home." Jake found his voice then, despite the tremor in his hands. "Sir, I want you to know that I love your daughter, and I would never do anything to hurt her. I know who you are, Mr. McKenzie, and I know what you did to my family, but Clara isn't responsible for that, and she doesn't deserve to pay for your sins." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired gun. Samuel could have killed Jake where he stood, could have destroyed him entirely. Instead, he did something that shocked even himself. He turned and walked away without saying another word. But this wasn't mercy. This was the calm before a storm that would reshape the entire territory. Samuel went home that night and sat in his study until dawn, staring at a portrait of his late wife. Eleanor had always told him that love was the strongest force in the world, stronger than fear or greed or hatred. Watching Clara and Jake together had awakened something in him that he had buried with his wife, the memory of what it felt like to love someone more than you loved yourself. What happened over the next 3 days would become legend in Copper Ridge and beyond. Samuel McKenzie didn't come home that night, or the next. Clara waited in terrified anticipation, expecting him to burst through the door with violence and retribution. But Samuel was elsewhere, putting into motion a plan so audacious that when word of it spread through the territory, even hardened criminals stopped what they were doing to listen in amazement. Samuel McKenzie, the man who had spent years taking from others, had decided to give everything away. He began by visiting every family he had ever foreclosed upon, every person he had driven into debt and despair. To each one, he brought a portion of his wealth, enough to rebuild their lives, to buy back their land, to start again. The first family he visited was the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson fainted when she opened the door to find Samuel McKenzie standing on her porch with a bag of gold and the deed to the property he had seized 3 years earlier. "I can't undo what I did," Samuel told them, "but I can try to make it right." When word spread that Samuel McKenzie was giving away his fortune, people thought it was a trick. But as the days passed and the gifts continued, the territory began to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Samuel visited the widow Johnson, whose husband had hanged himself rather than face losing their farm. He gave her enough money to buy a new house and fund her children's education. He tracked down families who had fled to distant states and sent them bank drafts to establish new lives. He paid off the debts of 17 different families, returned deeds to properties he had foreclosed, and funded construction of a new schoolhouse and church. Some people he approached refused to see him, slammed doors in his face, or threw his money back at him. But others, worn down by years of poverty and hardship, accepted his gifts with tears and disbelief. Samuel didn't ask for forgiveness. Samuel McKenzie was too proud for that. But he offered something far rarer: restitution. The news spread like wildfire through the territory. The most hated man in 3 counties was giving away his fortune, piece by piece, debt by debt. The transformation of Samuel McKenzie had begun to change not just individual lives, but the very fabric of the territory itself. But Clara didn't know about her father's desperate campaign of redemption. All she knew was that he had discovered her secret and then vanished. Leaving her in a state of suspended terror, Jake had offered to take her away immediately, to run for the California goldfields where they could disappear forever. But Clara couldn't bring herself to abandon her father without understanding what he was planning. She had lived with his darkness for so long that his sudden absence felt like waiting for an earthquake building beneath her feet. On the 3rd day, Samuel finally returned home, but he was not the same man who had ridden out. His face was haggard, his clothes dusty from the road, and something fundamental had changed in his eyes. He looked older, but there was also a kind of peace that Clara had never seen in her father before. He looked at Clara across the kitchen table where they had shared so many silent meals, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "I know about you and Jake Sullivan," he said, and Clara braced herself for the explosion that never came. "I know who he is, what his family meant to him, and what I did to them. I know you love him, and I know he loves you." Samuel paused, looking down at his hands that had taken so much from so many. "I've spent the last 3 days trying to fix what I've broken, trying to become a man worthy of having a daughter like you. I don't know if it's possible, and I don't know if it's too late, but I need you to know that everything I've done, all the cruelty and greed, none of it was worth losing you." Clara stared at her father, unable to believe what she was hearing. This man who had ruled through fear and intimidation was sitting before her, vulnerable and broken, offering her something she had never dared to hope for: his understanding. But it was what he said next that would shock not just Clara, but the entire Wild West. "I'm giving Jake Sullivan the deed to his family's farm," Samuel continued, pulling a legal document from his coat. "And I'm giving him enough money to stock it, to build a house, to make it a place where you could be happy. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking you to stay. You have every right to hate me. I'm just asking you to make your choice based on love, not fear." He stood up slowly, suddenly looking far older than his 50 years, but also somehow lighter. "Jake is waiting for you at the Henderson place. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you choose to leave with him, I'll understand. If you choose to stay and help me try to become a better man, I'll spend every day proving I'm worthy of that gift." Samuel walked toward the door, then paused without turning around. "Your mother would have been proud of the woman you've become. She would have been ashamed of the man I let myself become. Maybe it's not too late to change that." Clara sat alone in the kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the deed her father had left on the table. The document was real, signed and notarized, transferring ownership of 200 acres of prime farmland back to the Sullivan family name. Attached to it was a bank draft for an amount that made Clara's hands shake. Enough money to stock the farm, build a house, and live comfortably for years to come. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of Jake's hair when the light hit it just right. When Clara finally stood up and walked out the door, she wasn't sure where she was going or what she would say when she got there. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, she was making a choice based on love instead of fear. She found Jake waiting by the corral behind the Henderson house, pacing nervously as he watched the road for any sign of Samuel McKenzie's approach. When he saw Clara walking toward him in the twilight, his face lit up with relief and hope. But it was the expression on her face that told him everything had changed. "My father knows," Clara said simply, and Jake tensed. his hand instinctively moving toward the gun he had started carrying. But Clara held up the deed, and Jake's eyes widened as he read his family's name on the faded document. "He's giving this to you," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "The farm, the money to rebuild it, everything he says he wants me to choose based on love, not fear." Jake stared at the deed, then at Clara, then back at the deed, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. "This is some kind of trick," he said finally. "Men like Samuel McKenzie don't just change overnight?" Clara moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "Maybe they don't," she admitted, "but maybe when they're faced with losing the only thing that matters to them, they find a way to become someone different. Maybe love is stronger than hate, even in someone like him." Jake looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or deception. "What are you saying, Clara? Are you telling me you want to stay with him, to try to build some kind of family with a man who destroyed mine?" Clara smiled then, the first truly free smile of her life. "I'm saying I want to build a family with you, here on your land, in the house we'll rebuild together. I'm saying I want to give my father a chance to be the grandfather our children deserve, instead of the monster he's been." It took 3 months for the full scope of Samuel McKenzie's transformation to become clear throughout the territory. By Christmas of that year, he had returned property to 17 families, paid off the debts of dozens more, and single-handedly funded the construction of a new schoolhouse and church in Copper Ridge. Some said he had found religion, others claimed he had simply gone mad with guilt. But those who knew the truth understood that Samuel McKenzie had found something far more powerful than religion or madness. He had found the possibility of redemption through his daughter's love. The wedding of Clara McKenzie and Jake Sullivan took place on a crisp spring morning at the newly rebuilt Sullivan farm, with Samuel McKenzie himself walking his daughter down the aisle he had helped Jake construct. The sight of the territory's most feared debt collector giving away his only child to the son of his former victims was something that witnesses would talk about for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most shocking moment came during the ceremony itself, when Reverend Hayes asked if anyone had objections to the union. Samuel stood up slowly, and the entire congregation held its breath, expecting some final act of cruelty or control. Instead, Samuel McKenzie looked at his daughter and the man she loved, and spoke the words that completed his transformation. "I have no objections to this marriage. I only have gratitude that my daughter found a love strong enough to change even a man like me." The story of Samuel McKenzie's redemption spread far beyond Copper Ridge, carried by travelers and traders to every corner of the Wild West. It became a legend told around campfires and in saloons, the tale of how love had conquered the cruelest heart in the territory. Some versions of the story grew in the telling. They said Samuel had given away $1 million, that he had single-handedly rebuilt entire towns, that he had become a preacher or a saint. But the truth was both simpler and more remarkable than any legend. Clara and Jake built their life on the Sullivan farm with a joy and purpose that seemed to radiate outward, touching everyone around them. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Mary after Jake's mother, Samuel held his granddaughter, with tears streaming down his face, marveling at how something so pure and innocent could come from his dark bloodline. "She's perfect," he whispered to Clara. "She's hope," Clara replied, watching her father discover a capacity for love he had never known he possessed. "She's proof that people can change, that love really can conquer everything." Years later, when Samuel McKenzie died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, the funeral was attended by hundreds of people from across the territory. Many of them were families he had once destroyed, people who had every reason to hate him, who had come to pay their respects to the man who had found a way to make amends for a lifetime of cruelty. Jake Sullivan, now a prosperous rancher and respected member of the community, delivered the eulogy for his former enemy, turned beloved father-in-law. "Samuel McKenzie was not a perfect man," Jake told the assembled crowd. "He made terrible mistakes, hurt good people, and caused more pain than any one person should. But in the end, he proved that it's never too late to choose love over hate, never too late to become the person you were meant to be. He taught us that redemption is possible for anyone brave enough to seek it, and that love, true love, has the power to transform even the darkest heart." As the mourners dispersed and the sun set over Copper Ridge, Clara stood beside her husband and their 3 children, looking at the headstone that bore her father's name and the inscription she had chosen: Samuel McKenzie, father, grandfather, and proof that love conquers all. The legend of Samuel McKenzie's transformation became one of the most famous stories in Wild West history, but for Clara and Jake, it was simply the foundation of their life together. They raised their children on the rebuilt Sullivan farm, teaching them that love was stronger than hatred, that forgiveness was more powerful than revenge, and that every person, no matter how far they had fallen, deserved the chance to become something better. The old oak tree where Clara and Jake had first met became a local landmark where young couples would come to pledge their love to each other, believing that the magic of that place would bless their union with the same transformative power that had changed the Mackenzie family forever. Clara would often bring her children to sit beneath that tree, telling them the story of how their grandfather had been the most feared man in the territory until love showed him a better way. The story became a parable that parents throughout the territory would tell their children, a reminder that no matter how dark the world might seem, love always had the power to bring light. Ministers would use Samuel Mackenzie's redemption as an example in their sermons about forgiveness and second chances. Teachers would tell the story to illustrate the importance of choosing compassion over hatred, and young people facing their own difficult choices would remember Clara McKenzie's courage in choosing love over fear, and find the strength to follow their hearts instead of their fears. The Sullivan farm continued to be worked by Clara and Jake's descendants for generations, becoming one of the most prosperous and respected operations in the territory. The house that Jake had built for his bride was expanded and improved over the years, but the original foundation stones remained, inscribed with the date of their wedding and the words "built on love." Visitors to the farm would often comment on the sense of peace that seemed to permeate the place, as if the land itself had been blessed by the redemption that had taken place there. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind swept across the prairie and the stars shone down on the home they had built together, Clara would think about that October evening when she had first stepped out of the shadows to meet her forbidden love. She would remember the terror and the hope, the impossible choice between family and freedom, and the moment when love had proven itself capable of miracles. Because that's what it had been, really, a miracle. Not the kind written about in books or preached from pulpits, but the quiet, everyday miracle of two hearts choosing to trust in something greater than fear. The miracle of a daughter's love redeeming her father's soul, of an enemy becoming family, of the Wild West learning that sometimes the most shocking thing of all was simply the power of love to transform the world, one heart at a time. The Wild West had seen many shocking things in its violent history, but perhaps none more shocking than the power of a daughter's love to transform a man's soul, and in doing so, transform an entire way of life 30 years after Samuel Mackenzie's funeral, when Clara Sullivan was 67 and her hair had turned the same silver as her mother's pearls. A young journalist from the Denver Post arrived at the Sullivan farm to write about the legend he had traveled from the bustling cities of the East, where the Wild West had become nothing more than dime novels and Buffalo Bill's traveling shows, seeking to separate fact from fiction in what newspapers were calling the greatest redemption story ever told. Clara received him on the same porch where her father had once sat planning his campaigns of cruelty, but now the space was filled with rocking chairs hand-carved by Jake, quilts stitched by 3 generations of Sullivan women, and the laughter of great-grandchildren playing in the yard where Samuel McKenzie had once counted his blood money. The journalist, a pale young man named Henry Morrison, who had never seen anything wilder than Central Park, expected to find an old woman eager to romanticize her past, to spin tales of frontier adventure that would sell newspapers in Chicago and New York. Instead, he found Clara Sullivan tending to her garden with dirt under her fingernails and truth in her eyes. "People always want to know if it really happened the way the stories say," she told him, her voice still carrying the strength that had once defied the most feared man in 3 territories. "They want to know if a man can really change that much, that fast, that completely. They want to know if love can truly conquer all." She paused in her weeding, looking out over the fields where Jake was teaching their youngest grandson to rope cattle, where the soil that had once been soaked with tears of the dispossessed now yielded crops that fed half the county. I'll tell you what I told my children and what they'll tell theirs, Clara continued, standing slowly and brushing the earth from her apron. My father was a monster who became a man, not because he found God, not because he went crazy with guilt, but because he finally understood that the only wealth that matters is the love of the people who choose to stay with you when they have every reason to leave. He learned that you can't build a legacy on other people's suffering. That power without compassion is just organized cruelty, and that it's never too late to become worthy of the love you've been given. The journalist scribbled frantically, trying to capture not just her words, but the way the setting sun painted her weathered face with gold, the way her voice grew stronger when she spoke of love, the way the very air around the Sullivan farm seemed to hum with contentment and peace. When Morrison published his article 3 months later, it became one of the most widely read pieces in the newspaper's history, reprinted from San Francisco to Boston, translated into 7 languages, and eventually adapted into stage plays and moving pictures. But Clara never read it. She had more important things to do, children to raise, crops to tend, and a husband to love until the end of their days. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones written in newspapers or carved in stone, but the ones lived quietly, day by day, choice by choice, in the everyday miracle of hearts that choose to love instead of hate, to forgive instead of punish, to build instead of destroy. And in that small corner of Wyoming where the legend began, that story continued to be written, one generation at a time, in the enduring proof that love truly can conquer all.